What if I told you that some of the most powerful men who ever lived, conquerors who shaped civilizations and emperors who built monuments that still stand today, carried secrets so profound that entire empires worked to erase them? We're uncovering the truth about 30 kings whose love stories were written in whispers and buried in shame. These aren't just rumors or gossip. These are documented relationships that historians have spent centuries trying to downplay or ignore completely. And we're starting with two names you definitely know, but whose real stories will absolutely blow your mind. Before we dive into these incredible untold stories together, I'd love it if you could join our fellowship of history explorers. The best way to do that is by hitting that subscribe button and giving this video a thumbs up, but only if these stories truly surprise you. I'm really curious. Where are you watching this from? And what time is it where you are? Drop a comment and let me know if you're a night owl like me, or maybe you're on the other side of the world starting your day with some hidden history. Let's dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's uncover these ancient secrets that have been hidden for far too long. Alexander the Great and Hephaestion. Our first stop takes us back over 2,000 years to ancient Macedonia, where a young prince was about to become the most feared conqueror in human history. But behind Alexander the Great's legendary military campaigns was a love story so intense that would define not just his personal life, but the very fate of his empire. It's 356 BC, and in the royal court of Macedonia, two boys are growing up together, destined for greatness. The other is Hephaestion, a nobleman's son who would become Alexander's closest companion. But here's what they don't teach you in school. These two weren't just best friends. Including the historian Plutarch, describe a relationship so intimate and exclusive that it was understood by all. Alexander and Hephaestion were inseparable from childhood. They studied together under Aristotle, trained together as warriors, and when Alexander began his conquest of the known world, Hephaestion was always by his side. But as what the Greeks called his philos, his beloved, ancient writers describe how they performed rituals together at the tomb of Achilles and Patroclus, the legendary Greek lovers, symbolically declaring their own bond to the world. When they visited Troy, Alexander laid a wreath at Achilles' tomb while Hephaestion honored Patroclus. They were publicly comparing themselves to history's most famous same-sex couple. The message was clear to anyone who understood Greek culture, yet this detail is often conveniently left out of modern history books. The depth of their relationship becomes heartbreakingly clear when Hephaestion died suddenly in 324 BC. Alexander didn't just mourn, he completely unraveled. He ordered the execution of Hephaestion's doctor. He had the manes and tails cut from every horse and mule in the army as a sign of mourning. Ancient historians say Alexander threw himself on Hephaestion's body and refused to eat or drink for days. But here's the detail that tells you everything. Alexander consulted an oracle, asking if he could worship Hephaestion as a god. When that was denied, he settled for having him worshipped as a divine hero. The man who conquered most of the known world was so devastated by the loss of a companion that he wanted to literally deify him. Emperor Hadrian and Antinous. Let's jump forward about 300 years to Rome, where another emperor shocked the ancient world with his own forbidden love. Emperor Hadrian is remembered for building his famous wall across Britain, but his most passionate relationship was with a beautiful young man from Bithynia named Antinous. Hadrian met Antinous around 123 AD when the boy was a teenager. What began as a typical Roman mentor-student relationship quickly evolved into something much deeper. Unlike Alexander and Hephaestion, Hadrian was a middle-aged emperor falling in love with someone young enough to be his son, and he didn't care who knew it. Antinous traveled everywhere with Hadrian, appearing in official court ceremonies. Ancient coins were minted with Antinous' face alongside Hadrian's, an unprecedented honor for a non-royal. The emperor commissioned hundreds of statues of his young lover, more than any other private individual in Roman history. This level of public devotion was shocking even by Roman standards. But the story takes a tragic turn in 130 AD, when Antinous mysteriously drowned in the Nile River. The official story was an accident, but theories of suicide or ritual sacrifice have persisted for centuries. Hadrian's reaction was immediate and extreme. He declared Antinous a god, founded an entire city in his honor called Antinopolis, and established a religious cult that would survive for centuries. Hadrian literally created a new religion centered around his dead lover, with temples built across the empire for his worship. Ancient sources say Hadrian wept openly at official functions for months. It was the act of a man whose entire world had collapsed. What makes both of these stories so powerful is how these rulers used their immense power to honor relationships their societies couldn't fully legitimize. Both Alexander and Hadrian were married to women for political reasons and fulfilled their public duties. Yet their deepest emotional connections were with men, and the historical evidence is overwhelming. The tragic irony is that both relationships ended in devastating loss that weakened these great rulers. Alexander died less than a year after Hephaestion, many believe from grief. Though he lived longer, never recovered from Antinous' death. They were so intense they shaped the course of empires. But Alexander and Hadrian were just the beginning. As we move through history, we'll discover that medieval Europe held even darker secrets. We travel to the age of Crusades, where two of the most famous medieval rulers harbored secrets that would have destroyed their reigns if discovered: Richard the Lionheart and King James I. Welcome to the age of holy wars and divine kings, where the cross and the crown created a deadly combination for anyone with forbidden desires. In medieval Europe, being discovered in the wrong bed didn't just mean scandal, it meant damnation. Even in this world of religious terror, two powerful monarchs couldn't resist the pull of forbidden love. Richard the Lionheart. The name conjures images of a heroic Christian warrior. But here's what the movies don't tell you. Richard spent barely 6 months of his 10-year reign in England. He was far more interested in his campaigns abroad, specifically in a certain French king who was supposed to be his enemy. In 1187, Richard, the future king of England, met Philip Augustus, heir to the French throne. They should have been rivals. Something extraordinary happened. Contemporary chroniclers describe how Richard and Philip became so close that they ate from the same dish and slept in the same bed. Who were very careful with their words, mentioned two kings sharing a bed. It was their polite way of signaling something far more intimate. When Richard's father, King Henry II, saw their closeness, he became extremely fearful and tried to separate them, suggesting he recognized a bond deeper than a simple political alliance. Their relationship grew complicated during the Third Crusade. Instead of working together, they engaged in bitter personal conflicts, marked by jealous rages and emotional reconciliations that baffled their advisors. Many historians believe Philip's sudden abandonment of the crusade in 1191 was due to his inability to handle Richard's obsession and possibly other relationships. Meanwhile, Richard showed little interest in his wife, Queen Berengaria. They had no children, a massive failure for a medieval king whose primary duty was to produce an heir. The lack of an heir from his marriage, combined with his documented intimacy with Philip and other men in his inner circle, paints a clear picture of a king whose heart lay outside the bounds of his royal duty. Let's jump forward 400 years to King James I of England, famous for commissioning the King James Bible. The irony is staggering. The man who gave the English-speaking world his most influential version of the Bible lived in open violation of his teachings. James had several well-documented relationships with handsome young men, the most famous being with George Villiers, whom James elevated from a minor nobleman to the Duke of Buckingham, making him one of the most powerful men in England. James was not subtle. Contemporary accounts describe him fondling Villiers in public and calling him his sweet child and wife. The Venetian ambassador wrote detailed reports describing James' extraordinary affection for Villiers. In letters, James called himself Villiers' dear dad. These weren't private notes. They were official correspondence. The English court was scandalized. A contemporary writer, Francis Osborne, wrote that the king would tumble and kiss Villiers in front of foreign ambassadors. But here's the crazy part. James was king by divine right. As long as he produced heirs with his wife and of Denmark, which he did, his personal life was technically untouchable. His favoritism, however, created massive political instability, with nobles constantly plotting against whichever young man held the king's affections. Both Richard and James reveal a strange double standard in a repressive era. What would have been a death sentence for a commoner could be tolerated in a king, but only if he maintained a crucial appearance of fulfilling his dynastic duties. Lorenzo de' Medici and Henri III. The Renaissance changed everything. Europe became obsessed with beauty, art, and the classical world, where same-sex relationships were often celebrated. But while the Catholic Church's power remained absolute, wealthy princes and kings found creative ways to live double lives. Let's start in Florence, with Lorenzo de' Medici, known as the Magnificent. He was a ruler, poet, philosopher, and patron of the arts. But beneath that cultural refinement was a man whose deepest passions lay in directions that could have destroyed him. What's captivating about Lorenzo is that he didn't just have relationships with men. In 15th century Italy, Lorenzo was composing love sonnets to beautiful young men and sharing them at dinner parties with cardinals. His genius was in the framing. He wrote these poems in the style of classical Greek and Roman verse, hiding his contemporary relationships behind the acceptable veneer of scholarly appreciation for ancient culture. He was essentially saying, "I'm not writing gay poetry, I'm just a classic scholar." His most documented relationship was with Girolamo Benivieni, a philosopher who lived in the Medici palace for years. They were inseparable, sharing intellectual pursuits and what observers called intimate philosophical discussions. Lorenzo managed this lifestyle, while married with 4 children, by embracing the Renaissance concept of different types of matrimonial love was for family and politics. Spiritual love was for intellectual and emotional connection. His relationships with men fell into the latter category. He created a cultural environment where forbidden love could flourish under protection of art and scholarship, commissioning countless artworks of beautiful young men in mythological settings, and funding the translation of classical texts the church usually banned. He was using his wealth to create a Renaissance gay scene right under the Pope's nose. Let's travel to France, where Henri III took a completely different approach. If Lorenzo was subtle, Henri was dramatic, flamboyant, and shameless. He became king in 1574 and immediately surrounded himself with handsome noblemen called the Mignons, the darlings, treating them as a combination of advisors and lovers. Contemporary sources describe them wearing their hair long and curled, dressing in silk, and openly sharing the king's bed. Henry's most famous relationship was with and to Joyeuse. When Joyeuse married for political reasons, Henri threw a 15-day wedding celebration that nearly bankrupted France, and was so distraught he acted like a jealous lover. Henri survived not by hiding, but by being so openly theatrical that people couldn't distinguish performance from reality. He would appear at court in pearl earrings and silk gowns. Was he a fashion icon? Was it a political statement? The ambiguity was a shield. Both Lorenzo and Henri show how the Renaissance created new possibilities for powerful men. Lorenzo used intellectualism as cover, while Henri used theatricality. But the psychological cost was enormous. Lorenzo's poetry is filled with the pain of secrecy, and Henry's court was described as exhausting and surreal. Both died relatively young, and the tolerant worlds they built crumbled after their deaths. Their stories show us that even in repressive societies, cultural innovation can carve out fragile spaces for freedom. Mem the Conqueror and Murad IV. Now we cross into a completely different world, the Ottoman Empire. It was the most powerful force on earth, and within the magnificent palaces of Constantinople, the rules about power, religion, and desire operated by a different logic. Picture Constantinople in 1453, falling to a 21-year-old sultan who would reshape the world. He was brilliant, ruthless, and obsessed with both classical culture and beautiful young men. And unlike European kings, while Christian Europe was persecuting same-sex relationships, the Islamic world had a different approach. Persian and Turkish poetry celebrated male beauty, and the Ottoman court actually institutionalized these relationships. Sultans traditionally had wives for political alliances and male companions for emotional and intellectual connection. Mem's most documented relationship was with Radu Frumos, Radu the Beautiful, a Greek noble brought to court as a hostage. Byzantine chronicles say Mem became so infatuated he learned Greek poetry to write verses for him. But these companions weren't hidden lovers. They were mashiks, officially recognized favorites with specific roles, titles, and apartments in the palace. It was part of the governmental structure. Mem's relationship with Radu was also a political strategy. By placing a lover on the throne of a neighboring state, he created a loyal buffer for the empire. This was using emotional connection to build alliances in ways European kingdoms couldn't imagine. After conquering Constantinople, Mem turned it into a cultural center rivaling Florence, commissioning artworks that celebrated classical male beauty. He essentially created his ideal environment for the sophisticated relationships he valued. Let's jump forward 150 years to Murad IV, one of the most brutal rulers in Ottoman history. He personally executed thousands and banned everything from coffee to tobacco. But this terrifying sultan had a secret. French diplomatic records describe his intimate relationship with a young officer named Coach Mustafa. Murad would spend hours in private with him, discussing poetry and philosophy, a stark contrast to his public persona as a tyrant. Murad uses absolute power to create a private world. He held secret gatherings with a small group of young male courtiers for intellectual discussions. A Venetian explorer who visited his court wrote about the Sultan's tender side, visible only to a select few. Mehmed and Murad represent two different ways of handling the same needs within the Ottoman system. Mehmed was open and used his relationships as part of his public strategy. Murad was secretive and created a hidden world to express a vulnerability impossible. The key difference from their European counterparts was the cultural framework. The Ottoman Empire, influenced by Persian traditions, recognized multiple forms of love, creating a space for relationships that would have been impossible in London or Paris. The tragic irony is that both men died isolated despite their power. Mehmed at 50, possibly poisoned, from alcohol poisoning and paranoia. Their stories reveal how cultural context shapes personal possibility, showing that while European kings had to choose between authenticity and power, Ottoman sultans inherited systems that allowed for both, but only within very specific and often lonely parameters. Edward II and William III, the collision of personal passion and political reality, often led to national catastrophe. Edward II came to the throne in 1307, heir to a powerful kingdom, but he had no interest in military glory. He was completely obsessed with a knight named Piers Gaveston. This wasn't a hidden affair. Edward made Gaveston the Earl of Cornwall, showering him with power and wealth that outraged the English nobility. Chroniclers wrote that the king loved him above all mortals, and that their relationship caused scandal throughout the kingdom. The English barons weren't just upset about the king having a male lover. They were furious that Gaveston was essentially running the country, while Edward ignored his duties. They forced the king to exile Gaveston, but Edward was so desperate he traded away royal power to secure his lover's return. The relationship ultimately led to civil war. The barons captured and executed Gaveston in 1312. Edward's reaction was devastating. He declared war on his own nobles, a conflict that eventually cost him his throne and his life. Tragically, he never learned. He formed another intense relationship with Hugh Despenser, repeating the same pattern of favoritism that alienated his nobles and his wife. By 1326, Isabella had raised an army and invaded. Edward's support collapsed, forced to abdicate, and murdered in a manner that symbolically punished him for his relationships. His forbidden love cost him everything. Let's jump forward 3.5 centuries to William III, who came to the throne in 1689. He was married to Mary II, and together they were joint monarchs. But William spent most of his time with a small circle of handsome Dutch nobles. His most documented relationship was with Arnold Joost van Keppel. Court observers like Sarah Churchill wrote about William's extraordinary fondness for Keppel, noting that the king seemed more concerned with his companion's welfare than with affairs of state. William's story is different from Edward's. He was incredibly careful. Unlike Edward, who flaunted his favorites, William created a system where his relationships with men operated parallel to his royal duties. Court records suggest his wife Mary was fully aware of his relationships and had negotiated a private arrangement that allowed them to maintain their public roles while living separate personal lives. The contrast is fascinating. Edward chose passion over politics and lost everything. William chose politics over passion and kept his throne, but at the cost of becoming cold and isolated. Both stories reveal the impossible situation faced by English kings who couldn't conform to traditional expectations. The system demanded a performance of heterosexuality and masculine authority, offering no legitimate space for authentic emotional connections that fell outside those boundaries. Edward chose authenticity and was destroyed. William chose survival and lived a life of careful performance. Louis XIII and Philippe I, France had always been different. The French court turned forbidden relationships into an art form with elaborate systems of etiquette and managed scandal, allowing for relationships impossible elsewhere. Louis XIII, who ruled from 1610, was shy, deeply religious, and completely uninterested in his wife, and of Austria. They were married for 23 years before having their first child. But what Louis lacked in enthusiasm for his wife, he made up for in his passionate friendships with handsome noblemen. His most documented relationship was with Henri Coiffure de Ruse, Marquis de Cinq-Mars, a beautiful young man who joined the court at 18. Louis became utterly obsessed. A court memoirist wrote that the king could not bear to be separated from Cinq-Mars for even a few hours. This relationship became a crucial element in French politics. Cinq-Mars used his influence to build his own power base, eventually plotting against the king's chief minister. When Richelieu discovered the plot, he presented Louis with undeniable evidence of treason. The king's reaction reveals everything. He wept openly as he signed his favorite's death warrant, and then locked himself in his chambers for days. The execution broke Louis's spirit, and he died less than a year later, many believe from grief. Let's talk about Louis's nephew, Philippe I, who took this tradition of scandal to a new level. Philippe was a younger brother of the Sun King, and he lived his entire life as an openly gay man in the most public court in Europe. And somehow he thrived. Philippe rejected every convention about royal masculinity. He preferred women's clothing, makeup, and jewelry. He surrounded himself with male lovers and held elaborate cross-dressing parties. His most famous relationship was with the Chevalier de Lorraine, essentially his unofficial spouse who lived in the palace and wielded enormous influence. Philippe's own wife, Elizabeth Charlotte, wrote in her memoirs that he loved the Chevalier more than any woman he had ever known. But here's what's remarkable. Despite his flamboyant lifestyle, Philippe was one of the most successful military commanders of his generation, leading cavalry charges while wearing makeup and jewelry. His brother, Louis XIV, allowed it. It was a political calculation. By letting Philippe be openly different, Louis satisfied his brother's need for authenticity and prevented the kind of conspiracies that had destroyed other royal families. The French court simply pretended this was normal. Both Louis XIII and Philippe I show different strategies for navigating the same challenge. Louis tried to hide his relationships within traditional court structures and was destroyed when they created political conflict. Philippe openly defied conventions, but did so within a system his brother carefully controlled. Both stories reveal how the sophisticated French court could accommodate unconventional relationships, but only within specific parameters that preserved royal authority. Frederick the Great and Ludwig II of Bavaria. Germany in the 18th and 19th centuries was a different stage for royal romance. German princes turned to philosophy, art, and romantic idealism to create spaces for forbidden love. But this intellectual approach came with its own tragedies. Frederick the Great of Prussia was a military genius who transformed his country into a European power. But his emotional life was shaped by a severe trauma. As a young prince, he was in love with a Prussian officer, Hans Hermann von Katt. When his brutal father discovered their relationship and their plan to escape his court, he had Katt arrested for treason. In a final act of cruelty, he forced Frederick to watch from his prison window as Katt was beheaded. This experience fundamentally shaped Frederick's approach to relationships for the rest of his life. When he became king, he created a court at Sanssouci Palace where intellectual achievement and philosophical discussion provided cover for relationships that couldn't be acknowledged directly. He surrounded himself with brilliant minds, including the philosopher Voltaire. This intellectual environment provided space for his relationships with young men, particularly his lifelong companion, Michael Gabriel Fredersdorf. Frederick essentially intellectualized forbidden desire, reframing emotional connections as philosophical friendships that Enlightenment culture could admire. But the tragic irony is that this approach ultimately left him emotionally isolated. He became known as the Great for his achievements, but observers describe him as increasingly lonely and cynical. A century later, Ludwig II of Bavaria took the opposite approach. Instead of intellectualizing forbidden desire, he romanticized it to an extreme that overwhelmed his ability to function as a king. Ludwig became king at 18, and his approach to love and power was pure romantic fantasy. His most famous relationship was an all-consuming emotional obsession with the composer Richard Wagner. He would attend Wagner's operas dozens of times, often as the only person in the theater. His letters to Wagner are filled with romantic language, calling him my beloved friend and the only one who truly understands my soul. Ludwig made no attempt to hide or manage his relationships. He showered his lovers, who included aides, actors, and stable hands, with gifts and high positions. He built elaborate architectural fantasies, like the famous Neuschwanstein Castle, essentially shrines to his romantic idealism, where he could escape from political reality. He would spend nights in his castles hosting dinner parties for one, imagining conversations with historical figures. His romantic idealism gradually consumed his connection to reality. By the 1880s, his ministers declared him mentally unfit to rule. His death in 1886 remains a mystery. He was found dead in a lake with a psychiatrist. The official ruling was suicide, but many believe he was murdered. The contrast between Frederick and Ludwig is stark. Frederick channeled his emotional needs into intellectual achievement, creating a sustainable but distant approach to connection. Ludwig pursued absolute romantic authenticity, but in ways so disconnected from reality that they destroyed him. Both represent opposite extremes of how German Romanticism and Enlightenment could be applied to personal life. One protected himself but was left alone. The other pursued intense emotion but was ultimately destroyed by fantasy. As we reach the end of our journey through these 30 royal secrets, what strikes me most is how universal and timeless these stories really are. From Alexander the Great in ancient Macedonia to the troubled kings of modern Europe, we've seen the same fundamental human needs playing out across different cultures, religions, and political systems. Every one of these kings, whether they ruled through absolute power or constitutional constraint, faced the same basic challenge: how to be authentic while meeting the impossible expectations placed on royal authority. Some found creative solutions, using art, philosophy, or even scandal itself to carve out spaces where they could live and love authentically. Others were destroyed by the contradictions between personal desire and public duty. But all of them remind us that behind every crown, every ceremony, and every display of royal power was a human being struggling with the same needs for connection, understanding, and authentic love that drive all of us. These stories have been hidden for centuries, buried in diplomatic archives, disguised in court protocols, and coded in artistic patronage. But they're finally emerging, showing us that the history of forbidden royal love is really the history of human creativity in the face of impossible constraints. These 30 kings found ways to build meaningful relationships despite religious persecution, political opposition, and social rejection. Their strategies show us the incredible lengths people will go to live authentically. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through some of history's most closely guarded secrets. I hope these stories have given you a new perspective on both royal history and the universal human experience. The next time you see a royal portrait or read about a historical king, remember that behind all that pageantry and power were real people facing the same fundamental challenges we all face. Keep exploring, keep questioning the official stories, and keep looking for the human truth behind the legends. There are so many more incredible secrets waiting to be discovered, and I can't wait to share them with you. Until next time, sweet dreams, and remember, love always finds a way, even in the most impossible circumstances.